Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Catholic Family News. I'm Murray Rundus, the production manager and managing editor here at Catholic Family News. And we're back with some conclave analysis, some conclave coverage. Many of you saw the beginning analysis talking about just an overview of the conclave and Cardinal Muller's really opening statement that leads us into the conclave itself. And goodness gracious, we've seen a lot of drama unfolding already. And this conclave is taking a very different shape than conclaves that we've seen in the past. And the reason I say that is because a lot of this is based on reactions to doctrine expressed or rather not expressed by Pope Francis. And that's very unique. And this conclave is taking shape based on that, which is something we just really haven't seen before. And to begin, we're really going to be looking at an opening letter, an article written by Bishop Robert Barron. And Bishop Robert Barron is by no means a traditionalist. In fact, in some ways, he's been an opponent to the traditional Catholic movement. He's, of course, known for his Dare We Hope That All Are Saved controversy and his expressions on that, but he's also known for being a conservative Catholic, to put things that way. And he has said some things very defensive of Pope Francis. And his latest article really does lead us into what this conclave is really focusing on, which is this idea of this dynamic around unity through doctrinal clarity versus pushing forward a progressive agenda under the guise of this being continuing Pope Francis's legacy. And so we're going to begin with looking at some statements that Bishop Robert Barron made, how the conservative cardinals are really rallying around this message, which is in some ways similar to Cardinal Muller's message. And we're also going to be looking at how the liberal progressive cardinals are reacting to that, because they are reacting to it and they have a counter plan. And then we'll discuss who is better strategically positioned to have a successful run in this conclave. Now, to begin, we need to make sure that we're keeping everything supernaturalized when it comes to this. We're making sure that we're praying for the church, we're praying for the cardinals, because even though this is something that the human element of the church is very much so involved in, the Holy Spirit does not pick the Pope in a way of infallibly showing the cardinals who the best man for the job is, but the Holy Spirit is involved. He's working on the hearts of the cardinals, and our prayers can certainly influence this. So we need to make sure we're involved in praying for the future pontiff, praying for the cardinals. But let's jump right into Bishop Barron's statements on the legacy of Francis. And this article is for First Things, again, not a traditionalist publication. And we're going to be starting about 2/3 into it, because I really think the first 2/3, it's mainly talking about Francis's legacy in terms of advocating environmentalism, his refusal to wear elaborate garments and elaborate vestments, and really that doesn't have as much to do with this conclave as his last part of this essay, which is very interesting and really in many ways vindicates the traditionalist talking points about the Francis pontificate. And we'll get into that as it comes, but we'll begin. He says, one of the messier moments of the Francis pontificate was the two-part synod on the family, which took place in 2014 and 2015. The fact that Walter Cardinal Kasper, a longtime advocate of allowing divorced and remarried Catholics to receive communion, spoke at the outset of the gathering, indicated rather clearly the direction that Pope Francis wanted the synod to take. Pausing there, we'll talk a bit about how Cardinal Kasper has been reacting to this conclave and reacting to some of the moves on the part of the conservative cardinals. He is definitely not a conservative, even in the Bishop Barron sense. And I think this really goes to show one of the critiques that traditionalists had, which was who is Pope Francis surrounding himself with, whether that be Father James Martin, who is frequently in the Vatican given special roles, or men like Cardinal Kasper, who is theologically problematic, to say the least. You can see even a conservative, not a traditionalist, like Bishop Barron, is pointing this out, even though we have been told, traditionalists for over 10 years, that, well, if you're critiquing the Pope on these sort of matters, you're suspected of schism. And we're seeing here now everything is coming to the forefront now that Pope Francis is no longer the reigning pontiff. He goes on, quote, but he was met with stiff resistance from bishops, especially from the developing world. And when the final document appeared, the famous Amoris Laetitia, the question seemed oddly unresolved, open to a variety of interpretations. When the Pope's apologists pointed to an obscure footnote buried deep in the document as providing the requisite clarity, many in the church were, to say the least, incredulous. And when 4 cardinals petitioned the Pope to resolve a number of puzzles, dubia in the technical jargon, that Amoris Laetitia had raised in their minds, they were basically ignored. Very important stuff there. Again, traditionalists have been critiqued for, oh, you're bringing up irrelevant things like the dubia cardinals being ignored. But here we're seeing Bishop Barron. And I think Bishop Barron, if those don't know, this man is not just a sort of celebrity bishop, a celebrity priest. He is very influential. He'll give prominent talks on theology and philosophy, very different from his online lectures. And he's an influential man in Rome among the episcopate, and I really do think among the cardinals themselves. And I think if he's expressing these concerns, I think this is a sign that even the more moderate voices, because Bishop Barron is certainly a moderate. I disagree with him on many aspects. I don't think, for example, his expression of the Dare We Hope thesis is something we need to be going around expressing. But this shows that many cardinals, many bishops in the church are thinking what Bishop Barron is saying. And what is that? It's that Amoris Laetitia was at the very least ambiguous, and ignoring the dubia cardinals was a concern. Why are we ignoring these cardinals, but we are immediately addressing the concerns of Father James Martin? And I'm sure the bishops want to see some more clarity. And that's something Bishop Barron goes on to say even further. He says, quote, there are indeed many beautiful insights in Amoris Laetitia, but they were largely overlooked due to the controversy and ambiguity that accompanied the document. Indeed, in the wake of its publication, a sort of, quote, doctrinal anarchy, end quote, was let loose, as various bishop conferences gave the document varying interpretations, so that, for example, what remained a mortal sin in Poland seemed permissible in Malta. If a primary responsibility of the Pope is to maintain unity in doctrine and morals, it is hard to see how Pope Francis met that obligation throughout that synodal process and its aftermath. And that's an amazing thing to see right there, that is a serious critique of Pope Francis. And again, this was published really even before Pope Francis's funeral. So if that's something where people are even restrained by that aspect of it, what are these bishops really thinking? What are they really saying? Because what Bishop Barron said there is effectively Pope Francis failed in his doctrinal role in the Pope, the Holy Father, the Bishop of Rome, the Supreme Pontiff. He's really meant to be that doctrinal unifier, that center of unity, that center of authority. And that's something that many of these cardinals, I think, are going to be thinking about. They're going to be thinking about, how can we have that unity in truth that Cardinal Muller was talking about? Now, Bishop Barron goes on even further. It's not just Amoris Laetitia. He says, end quote, he oddly did not seem to learn from this situation. In 2023, after the first round of the Synod on Synodality, Pope Francis's doctrinal chief, Victor Emmanuel Cardinal Fernandez, issued the statement Fiducia Supplicans, which allowed for the possibility of blessing those in same-sex unions. You can notice there is a difference. This shows a more moderate tone regarding Fiducia Supplicans that you would see from somebody like Cardinal Muller. Bishop Barron has decided to interpret it as blessing those in same-sex unions rather than blessing the same-sex unions themselves. That is a difference between a sort of moderate conservative, again, these terms are very relative, conservative and liberals, to the present College of Cardinals, but that shows a difference. Cardinal Muller would say it was blessing the unions themselves. It's extremely scandalous. Bishop Barron is saying it leans towards being scandalous because it's blessing those in same-sex unions. But again, he could even be restraining himself just because Pope Francis, his funeral hadn't been conducted yet. To say that a firestorm, he goes on, broke out in the Catholic world would be an understatement. And the opposition was led, once again, by Catholic leaders from the non-Western sphere. As a quick side note, that non-Western sphere is ironically where most of these cardinal appointments in recent years have been from. And that really should give us a clue on how this conclave might go and might be influenced. If Pope Francis is receiving opposition from those spheres, and that's where the cardinals from that from the world were chosen, I think we could see a reaction against that progressive message that Pope Francis was preaching. In an astonishing display of unity and courage, the bishops of Africa said that they would not enforce the teaching of fiducia in their countries, and the Pope backed down, permitting them to dissent from the document. That all of this unfolded immediately after a gathering of 400 leaders from around the Catholic world who were never consulted on the matter simply beggars belief. Once again, the Pope struggled to maintain the unity of the church. And wow, many traditionalists, I think, have overlooked this document. They didn't want to read through the fluff on the environmentalist notions and praising Francis, but that is a scathing critique of the Pope Francis pontificate. If that, because we must think about that. If we're saying that resistance, dissent from fiducia supplicans, again, something traditionalists have been constantly attacked as being schismatic for doing. If Bishop Barron, a mainstream leader in the Catholic Church, is saying that it is a courageous and astonishing display to be able to resist fiducia supplicans, a document in the church. It's proving once again something that Cardinal Muller pointed out, that in order to be a Catholic nowadays, we can't just say it's all about obeying whatever the Pope says. He said the term obeying doctrine. A better word might be assenting to doctrine. But you can't simply do that anymore when it comes to whatever the Pope is saying. Rather, we have to look at what tradition and scripture has said as well. Tradition, the teaching of past pontiffs, higher weighted magisterial teachings that outweigh present teaching that goes against prior sources of truth. And so to see Bishop Barron say that is quite astonishing itself. And he goes on even further. Again, those are two major critiques. If the Pope is just known for those two flaws, I think that is a major dark spot in his legacy if he has those two major doctrinal holes in his teaching. But Bishop Barron goes further. He says, at times, too, the Pope's admirably generous instincts appeared to lead him into saying doctrinally imprecise things or countenancing problematic behaviors, giving face to problematic behaviors. An example of the first would be his endorsement on a number of occasions of the proposition that all religions are legitimate paths to God, like differing languages speaking the same truth. Now, given his clear enthusiasm for evangelization, I want to be generous in my interpretation of his words, construing them perhaps along the lines of the Second Vatican Council's assertion that there are elements of truth in all religions. But I think it is fair to say that the Pope at least gave the strong impression of religious indifferentism. Now, that is a serious critique because, of course, religious indifferentism is outright and a complete error for Catholicism. And if the Pope is even giving that impression, that is serious. And that's a major problem for a Pope in that office to be saying that. And we're seeing, again, mainstream leader, somebody that many of the cardinals respect, much of the episcopate respects, the mainstream world respects Bishop Barron. He's saying that is a problem. Now, on his note about the Second Vatican Council, that shows us a couple things. One, Bishop Barron himself is actually giving a bit of a overly generous, I think, interpretation of the Second Vatican Council, saying that it's merely elements of truth in all religions. A traditionalist like myself would point out that really we're having a problem saying that those elements are salvific, which Pope Francis even went beyond and seemed to say that much, saying, again, all religions are lead to the same thing, lead to God, and are it's like different languages. That goes beyond just saying, oh, well, somebody might have a natural knowledge of God. This religion teaches a certain virtue. I think it goes beyond that. And I think Bishop Barron deep down knows that. I think you can even see, kind of read between the lines there, that's what he's saying. Again, we see this phrase brought up a lot. Bishop Barron said it. His clear enthusiasm for evangelization. Well, it's difficult to have an enthusiasm for evangelization if everybody is going to heaven, if everybody is on the path to reach God. And so I think that's extremely problematic. And again, if you're a bishop on the peripheries, if you're in a place where Catholicism is really struggling to thrive, even in some more Protestant countries in Europe, I think many of those cardinals, many of these bishops are going to be thinking to themselves, well, we need to be able to show that Catholicism is the way. It's the way of Jesus Christ. It's not just one religion among many. And I also think when it comes to looking at that Second Vatican Council mention of Bishop Barron, it does show that a lot of these controversies, it goes back to the Second Vatican Council, which is a traditionalist point. If all of the progressives are pointing to the Second Vatican Council as being their source of dissenting from the church doctrine of the ages, I think that should lead us to say, well, maybe the Second Vatican Council isn't also clear. It might have beautiful words. People always say, go read the documents. You'll find they're very beautiful. But perhaps there is some ambiguity there. Perhaps there's some things that have to be worked out in those council documents. Pope Francis, if he's using the Second Vatican Council to express a, quote, strong impression of religious indifferentism, that's a problem. And that's something I think even many of these more traditionalist leaning cardinals, but much of the college, I think, might be thinking of as well, especially if that's the line of reasoning many of these people are taking. He goes on. As an example of his countenancing problematic behaviors, I would point to the infamous Pachamama incident at the Synod on the Amazon in 2019. Though there remains a good deal of confusion about the purpose of the placement of the Pachamama statue in the Vatican gardens during a prayer with the Pope, it is certainly fair to say that it generated much controversy and that the various attempts to explain it only made matters worse. Once more, the Pope found himself in the middle of a self-created and completely unnecessary kerfuffle. The man supposed to guarantee unity, at least implicitly undermining it. Again, that's a strong critique. That's something you might hear on Catholic Family News, and it's proving these people wrong who went out and said, you're causing dissent in the church, you're causing scandal by even mentioning the Pachamama incident and not interpreting it with the utmost charity. I think we're seeing even mainstream cardinals, mainstream bishops like Bishop Barron, they're saying this was a scandal. And all of these different explanations that you have some nude woman who is connected to a Amazonian goddess, but somehow connected to Saint Elizabeth or Our Lady, that's not going to cut it, especially when the whole press is thinking that this is that Pachamama goddess. People are bowing down to it. Again, there's been much debate about that, but I think now that people are seeing things with a more clear mind, with clear sight, they're seeing that this was an actual scandal. And to see a bishop say that, I'm glad Bishop Barron came out with that. And certainly in African countries and in some Asian countries as well, where paganism is still a prominent issue, you have people reverting back to ancestral religions where you have pagan idols. I think that was a scandal for many of those periphery cardinals, and they occupy a large amount of the College of Cardinals at the moment. And that's got to be a concern for them, just as it's a concern for not just Americans in the West that are being hypercritical, but for anybody who's trying to be a faithful Catholic. He says, no one doubts that Pope Francis was rhetorically gifted, not in the manner of John Paul II or Benedict XVI, to be sure, but in the manner of a parish priest, adept at popular homilizing. And his speech very often had an edge. Here are a few of his gems: Mr. and Mrs. Weiner, liquid Christian; pickled pepper-faced Christian, weak to the point of rottenness; church who is more spinster than mother. And I believe it is fair to say that his rhetorical venom was more often than not directed at conservative Catholics. Here are a few more zingers: the closed, legalistic slave of his own rigidity, doctors of the letter. Rigidity conceals the leading of a double life, something pathological. Professionals of the sacred, reactionaries, and most famously, backwardists. That's why I think it's very hard for people when you have people who are Pope apologists going out and saying, look how humble this man was, look how caring and nice he was, and using examples of him going and talking to transgenders, for example. I think many conservative Catholics are saying, well, goodness, we've had our own struggles. We've had our communities taken away by things like Traditionis Custodes, and Bishop Barron neglects to mention the traditional Latin Mass here. Again, he's much more of a moderate figure. But I think many people are offended by being called names. I think that's against the spirit that Pope Francis was trying to put forward, the spirit of humility. And I think many people are having a hard time really feeling a lot of sympathy. But again, our Christian charity or Catholic charity demands we pray for the Holy Father, which we'll get to in a bit, and demands that we not take that to the point of leading us to a sense of hatred, for example. But I think it's very hard for people. That's why I understand the venom coming from the other side, because when you're mentioning those names, I think it is hurtful. And Bishop Barron admits this. He says, I know that these withering criticisms often deeply discouraged Orthodox Catholics, especially young priests and seminarians, whom the Pope once referred to as, quote, little monsters. On one occasion, during the first session of the Synod on Synodality, the Pope spoke to the assembled delegates. This sort of direct papal intervention was extremely rare, for, to his credit, the Pope did not want excessively to sway or dominate the discussion. He spoke in a sarcastic tone of young clerics in Rome who spend too much time at the clerical haberdashery shops, trying on hats, collars, and cassocks. Now, there may indeed be some immature priests and students who are preoccupied with such things, but it struck me as exceedingly strange that this was the topic the Pope chose for this rare opportunity to address some of the top leadership of the church. I agree. I don't think it's as big of a concern as the Pope was making it out to be. But I will say, I actually do think, I agree with Pope Francis that it is a problem, this excessive emphasis on outward appearance. And I must say, every sermon I've heard condemning that or making fun of priests who do that have been from traditionalist priests. The most hardcore people against that sort of attitude have been from Society of St. Pius X priests I've seen. And so I think it's sort of ironic in that way. And so, I also think it does go to show and I think Bishop Barron did this on purpose. The combination of using those names, that name calling, with at the same time saying, "Oh, these people are obsessed and they're deeply conceited," while focusing on the external. I don't think those two things are really in continuity with one another. I don't think those two things should go together. I think if one is critiquing somebody for being too ostentatious but having a conceited heart, we shouldn't be. I don't think many of those words Pope Francis used was consistent with that. But and again, Bishop Barron seems to think the same thing, which is this ironic closeness and position that traditionalists have with even Bishop Barron. I think this is because more people are just seeing clearly. He says, to me, it indicated a curious fixation on and demonization of the more conservatively minded. And what made matters even more mystifying is that Francis had to have known that the church is flourishing precisely among its more conservative members. As the famously liberal church of Germany withers on the vine, the conservative, supernaturally oriented church of Nigeria is exploding in numbers. Pausing there for a moment, there's a good book by Osiusti Press I think people should look at. I don't think those numbers in Africa are completely legitimate. I think everywhere is experiencing especially in formerly third world countries, an explosion in population, and many of those people happen to be Catholic. But I don't always think that translates to everybody is being catechized properly. Everybody has a firm understanding of the church's teaching. And so I'm not entirely sure I would agree with all of that, but it is a good point. Many of the places that are now bastions of more orthodox teaching are sort of left behind, while it's almost like the liberal West is being pandered to, or at least was being pandered to under that pontificate. And I'm sure people, the periphery cardinals, are thinking that. He goes on, and in the West, the lively parts of the church are, without doubt, those that embrace a vibrant orthodoxy rather than those that accommodate the secularist culture. I'll pause there. I think I've seen that myself. The traditionalist communities, people have various issues with them, but they are always big in number. The churches are full. They're to the brim. The seminaries are full, almost always, and you don't always see that with liberal dioceses throughout the United States. So, good point, I think. Many of the Pope's expressions and stories were indeed funny, but one would be hard pressed to characterize them as invitations to dialogue with conservative interlocutors. Indeed, we haven't seen a whole lot of dialogue with traditionalist groups. We've seen a lot of shutting them down, rather than the endless dialogue we see with those outside of the church. By way of conclusion, I would like to say a few words about synodality, he says, which I believe Francis himself would identify as his signature theme. I was privileged to be an elected delegate to both sessions of the Synod on Synodality. For 2 months, I listened to and spoke with representatives from all over the world, and I learned a lot about how Catholics respond to challenges in remarkably diverse cultural milieu. I very much enjoyed the conversations, both those formal exchanges around the table and even more so the informal chats during coffee breaks. I came to understand the Pope's Jesuit inspired process of prayerful discernment. And as he'll mention, I think that's just a lot of fluff, honestly. I think anybody reading that will be like, okay, what good does that do? I mean, we have the Latin Mass shut down, and we have informal chats during coffee breaks. I just think that's a bit out of place, really. And I think even Bishop Barron realizes this. He says, I also came, I must admit, to appreciate the limits of synodality. Though every dialogue was lively and informative, very few of them moved towards decision, judgment, or resolution. Most were stuck at what Bernard Lonergan would call the second stage of the epistemic process. And there you see Bishop Barron's influence of the Nouvelle Theologie, Transcendental Thomism. He's certainly not a traditionalist in that regard. Namely, being intelligent or having bright ideas. They didn't move to Lonergan's third level, which is the act of making a judgment, much less to his fourth stage, which is that of a responsible action. So respectful were we of the process of conversation that we almost had a phobia of coming to decision. I think that's a good way of putting the whole entire process of synodality. He finishes with, this is a fatal problem for Christians entrusted with the evangelical command to announce Christ to the world. The upshot is something that I believe is repugnant to what Pope Francis has consistently said he wants the church to be: extroverted, mission-oriented, not stuck in the sacristy. I wondered at times during the 2 rounds of the synod whether synodality represented a tension within the mind and heart of Francis himself. Of all the popes in my lifetime, Francis is by far the one I knew the best. I was with him for 3 Octobers, the 2 already mentioned, and a third for the Synod on Young People in 2018. During those wonderful months, I saw him practically every day and had a few occasions to speak to him. I also encountered him on an ad limina visit and at a handful of other audiences. I always found him gracious, funny, and approachable. Once we had a short but intense spiritual conversation. I considered him my spiritual father and sincerely mourn his passing. Requiescat in pace. Now, I mentioned that last part. I read through it because I want to emphasize, too, that I agree we should see the Holy Father as a spiritual figure in the church that we should pray for. I want to remind everybody we need to pray for Francis's soul. However, we can't get around the fact that this whole entire essay, or at least the last parts of this essay, which is a significant chunk of it, was a critique of the Francis pontificate. And what are the themes that we can look to the conclave for? Well, firstly, it's that doctrinal unity that can lead to a broader unity in the church. We've seen a lot of Pope apologists wanting to make sure that everything Francis said and did was interpreted with the utmost charity, which I think tended towards a false charity. They would say things like, they would use an example of Pope Francis, for example, saying, well, Jesus is the way and the truth, and using that to defend him, saying all religions lead to God, as if one orthodox statement means an unorthodox statement is somehow orthodox, or that there must be a hermeneutic of continuity between the two. So we even saw this with pastoral gestures. When Pope Francis was reaching out towards the poor in a real way, or having good conversations good evangelical gestures towards the poor and the needy, somehow that justifies some of the exaggerated, excessive outreach towards transgender community that almost seem to give credence to groups like New Ways Ministry, who he invited. And I don't think necessarily saying the Pope's the Pope said this orthodox thing. I don't think that's a good justification for some of the more ambiguous things that he stated as well. Just because the Pope said some good things does not make everything he said good. And I think Bishop Barron is now sort of dispelling that. I think most of the bishops and cardinals that are even somewhat conservatively minded are realizing this as well. There were problems in the Pope Francis pontificate to the point where there is a lack of unity. There's a lack of unity in the whole entire church, but even within the pontificate itself, there's a lack of clarity as to what is being said. Now, all of that is, I think, the problems that the conservatives have brought up. We've discussed how the periphery cardinals might react to that positively. How are the progressive candidates and how are the progressive forces reacting to this? Well, we saw the start of this and the start of this reaction really at the funeral of Pope Francis, where we're seeing an attempt to try to solidify the progress, the moving forward of Pope Francis's message with a sort of infallibility around the entire thing. And the way this has been done in the past is by canonizing the man. And we saw there was many people, I think, that were scandalized of the quick canonization of John Paul II, the canonization tied with that of John the 23rd, of Paul VI. I think many people were bothered because not only did it seem too quick, but it seemed very obvious that there was this attempt to canonize the Second Vatican Council as being, and I think it's a legitimate ecumenical council, but with some problems in it. But there was this attempt to make everything have this allure of sanctity. Well, I think that is what is being attempted here. Cardinal Ray, in the homily that closed the funeral, said, "Pope Francis, pray for us from heaven," this Vatican News article says. Going on about his legacy and his various efforts, he ends with, I'll quote Vatican News here, "The homily closed on a tender note invoking the familiar words with which Pope Francis always ended his audiences and meetings. Do not forget to pray for me." With more applause rising from those present, Cardinal Ray said now, as Pope Francis rests in God's embrace, the faithful reversed that request, asking for their beloved Pope to intercede for the Church, for Rome, and the whole world from heaven. Quote, "Dear Francis, we now ask you to pray for us. May you bless the Church, bless Rome, and bless the whole world from heaven, as you did last Sunday from the balcony of this basilica, in a final embrace with all the people of God, but also embrace humanity that seeks the truth with a sincere heart and holds high the torch of hope." Now, St. Thomas Aquinas, many theologians will say those in purgatory cannot pray for the faithful on earth. They are in a state where they need the prayers of the faithful. And I think it's, goodness, if I was in purgatory, I wouldn't want people canonizing me at my funeral, because I would want the prayers to be able to relieve my suffering. But that does not seem to have happened here. It seems that we're wanting to canonize Pope Francis off the bat, asking for his intercession, which really what is going on here, it's a political move to try to solidify Pope Francis's pontificate completely as being this full of sanctity, full of infallibility all over the place, which I just don't think that is the case. That's not going to be enough to defend from the confusing moments that are evidently in his pontificate. And indeed, we've seen this taken a step further, used to react to some of the statements made, I'm sure, by people like Bishop Barron, but most especially Cardinal Muller, who emphasized that unity in truth. And so we've seen more progressive cardinals, seen as closely aligned with Pope Francis, really striking back, saying that unity is something we shouldn't really go for. So I want to talk about this article that was released. This was originally with the New York Times. Here it's Business Standard that was reporting on it. He says, even before Pope Francis was entombed in a Rome basilica on Saturday, conservative cardinals, like Cardinal Muller, who felt his pontificate was a divisive disaster that endangered the church's traditions, had begun politicking to sway the conclave, electing the next pope. They have a simple slogan, unity. Now, they go into an interview with Cardinal Czerny of Canada, and he says, talking about unity, that it sounds really good, said Cardinal Michael Czerny of Canada, who was one of Pope Francis's closest advisors, but it means reversal. For those who opposed Francis, many of them appointed by his predecessor, Benedict XVI, unity means a new introversion with a promise of unity solving all of our problems. If you ask me, how could you name the wrong track for the conclave? I would say the idea that unity is the priority, said Cardinal Czerny. So that's obviously ridiculous, and especially the cardinal of the church would say that. We pray in the liturgy for unity of the church. Unity is something that is essential to Catholicity. That's what the word means. We're the universal church. And the idea that that's not something the cardinals should think about, especially in this divisive time, I think it's even a scandal. Now, finally, I mentioned that point about Cardinal Kasper. He's not a voting cardinal, so he doesn't have that much influence, but certainly these older cardinals, for example, on the more conservative side, Cardinal Zen made sure to go to Rome, and I think those older cardinals are going to play a role in influencing some of the voting cardinals. So Cardinal Kasper does play a role. He had an interview that really shows the direction the progressive cardinals are going. This was from Jacopo Scaramucci by La Repubblica, which is a very influential paper over there. And the interview here is the question was, Your Eminence, what is the main legacy of Pope Francis? The closeness of the church to all human beings, the cardinal says, and in particular to the poor and marginalized. They go on to say, and this is the key question right here, in your opinion, is it possible to go back on this onslaught by Francis? Now, I'm sure there's some things lost in translation. Onslaught has very negative connotation. I doubt that that's what he was going for. Again, before this, he says the Synod is his legacy. The church is all of us baptized, and we must walk together. But he answers that question on the onslaught by Francis. I don't think we can go back. I hope we can't go back. It wouldn't make sense. I believe we can move forward with a new pope. And so we're seeing we're seeing how the conclave battle is really going to shape up. It's going to be, what is the legacy of Pope Francis? Is it something entirely positive, or are there real concerns? And it seems already in this debate phase, this almost campaigning phase, which Pope Francis, as Cardinal Bergoglio, certainly won the last time in the conclave, where he made a very influential speech that apparently convinced many of the cardinals to vote for him. We're seeing a narrative come out now. It's about unity as being a positive aspect or a negative aspect, and who can really provide, which side can provide that doctrinal unity. And the other side is going to say, Pope Francis's legacy is so important. This has done such great things for the church. Let's move forward with it. Now, as a concluding analysis of the whole thing, I will say, I think the conservatives are coming in looking a lot more organized. I think Cardinal Muller's address, that did not come off to me as being some kind of a panicky statement. That came across to me as being very organized. It's almost as if all of these cardinals are working together in a sort of seamless motion. I wouldn't be surprised if they have clear ideas moving forward. I think the liberals, the more progressive candidates, the more progressive cardinals, were banking on the fact that many of these cardinals don't know each other. They weren't going to have a lot of time, and they could sort of come in, push forward using momentum. Cardinal Kasper in that interview said the numbers of people of people that were at Pope Francis's funeral proves that this is something we can't go back on. And I don't think really the numbers showed that. Pope Francis, and I hate getting into this sort of crowd measurement game where people are saying, well, this crowd, for example, like with Trump's inauguration versus Obama's inauguration, doesn't really prove any point at all. But I do think it shows that there is something wrong when we can look at John Paul II's funeral. There's 1 million people in the same time that there was 250,000 for Pope Francis, and say, well, I think some more people are skeptical and are worried about the way the church is going than some of the progressives would like to admit. And I think that interview with Cardinal Czerny, I think that shows more of a panicking kind of motion. Dismissing the idea of unity, I don't think that has good optics at all. So in my opinion, I think the conservatives are on the right track, looking for clear messaging, going in with this idea of let's get the church on track with doctrinal unity. Will they be able to get a good candidate who can come in there, restore the traditional Latin Mass, restore the church to doctrinal orthodoxy? Look, I don't think we can be too optimistic, especially the way the church has gone. But we can certainly pray for it. We shouldn't let this destroy our own spiritual lives with getting either in desolation or getting too optimistic and then getting completely disappointed. What this should do is call us to a closer study of the faith. What does it mean to be doctrinally orthodox? What does it mean to be in union with the universal church? Why are these cardinals having problems in the current state of the church? What are the issues involved? And I think that's a way we can use that to deepen our knowledge of the faith and thereby deepen our knowledge of the spiritual life as well, put that into practice. And so there's a lot here. There's a lot more to come. Certainly, we have the conclave is now announced for May the 7th, starting on that Wednesday, and we're going to be there. I'll be in Rome covering this for Catholic Family News, and it's going to be an exciting time. So we've got a lot going on. It needs to be a prayerful time for all of us, but stay tuned as we'll have more conclave coverage, conclave news for all of you. So do leave a like on this video, leave a comment, and make sure you subscribe as well to keep up with CFN. And if you're interested, you can go subscribe to our paper at CatholicFamilyNews.com or get the e-edition at CatholicFamilyNews.locals.com, and also get access to our conference coverage, our premium weekly news roundup, and more. So from all of us here at CFN, may God grant you many joyful years.